Check out my new fairy novel, The Ghosts of Nothing. Link in the description. There are fairies on the farm. It was late June, and I was on a camping trip with some friends. It was a normal trip at first. We drove out to some camping grounds we had been to before, hiked into the woods until we got to a good spot, and set up our tents. We were having a great time. But that evening, as the sun was setting, we set up a campfire and were cooking food when I saw a weird light I thought was a firefly. Now, I love fireflies, so I started tracking it with my eyes, hoping to see more. As I watched it, I realized there was something unusual about it. It was bigger than the average firefly and seemed to be moving in a strange way. I thought it might be injured, so I followed it. My friends were all chatting and focused on the food, so they didn't notice me wander away from them. I continued to follow the firefly. My attention was focused on it entirely, and the next thing I knew, I was in the woods, and the sounds of my friends talking and cooking had faded away. I had this moment where it was like I snapped out of a trance, and I got really scared. I thought I was lost and wouldn't be able to find my way back to the campsite. I looked around frantically to figure out which was the way back when I spotted the firefly again. I looked at it, looked away, and looked back again. And in the exact spot where the firefly had been, there was this little girl standing in the bushes staring at me. What happened next is hard to explain because it's both so bizarre and it happened extremely quickly. I looked at this girl. She looked at me. I blinked, and the girl wasn't a little girl anymore. She was an old woman. I blinked again, and the girl or old woman or whatever the heck I was seeing was gone. And there was a little firefly buzzing around in its place. Needless to say, I was completely petrified at this point, and I turned around and just ran in the opposite direction. I ran blindly, just hoping I was heading back to the campsite, and fortunately, I was. I suddenly heard my friends talking again and heard all the campsite noises. When my friends saw me, they could tell something had happened. Apparently, I'd gone white as a sheet. I wasn't able to speak about my experience. I just said I thought I saw something in the woods, but it was probably nothing. And I never spoke about it again until I found this channel. This happened in England, in Derbyshire. I was with 3 friends. The 4 of us were walking through the woods at night on our way back to this youth hostel we had hired for the weekend. As we were walking, we noticed about 10 feet away from us, amongst the trees, a small hooded figure. It was about 2 feet tall, dressed in a long, dark colored cloak, and sort of hunched over slightly. All 4 of us saw it. It seemed to know we had seen it. And there was some bad energy coming off it, and it did not feel friendly. We decided not to stick around. We quickly went forward on our way, but it followed us all the way through the woods, always at the same distance away. We weren't that far from the hostel at this point. From the time we saw the hooded figure to the time we arrived back took us about 5 minutes. But it followed us all the way. By the time we got back, we were quite frightened. All four of us, all adults, saw exactly the same thing. A small figure, about 2 feet tall, hunched and wrapped in a long hooded cloak. Discussing it later, we just all thought that a fairy was what we were seeing. I suppose because it was in the woods, was smaller than a human, and all of us could see it. I couldn't come up with any other explanation that made any sense. I'm from England, more specifically Lancashire. I would like to share two different encounters I had with what I believe to be fairies. Both encounters happened when I was out walking in the woods. I enjoy walking alone in nature. It helps clear my head, so I do it often. On this particular outing, I was walking along my usual trail, lost in my thoughts, when I noticed what I at first thought was a strange animal sitting on the branch of a tree. The animal was unusual enough that it caught my eye, and I immediately moved closer to it, trying to figure out what it was. As I moved closer, I realized that this thing didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen before or even heard of. It looked like a mix of a frog and a sparrow with a fuzzy coat all over it. It really was like a mix of two different animals, reptile and bird, almost like a chimera, a science experiment that never should have happened. It didn't move. It only glared at me with a look of malice. I could sense its intelligence, like it was thinking and planning. Then it faded away and became invisible. It was like a camouflage. I felt that it was still there, but I couldn't see it anymore. I was disturbed. I got out of there as fast as I could. The second encounter happened a few years later along the same trail. By this time, I hadn't thought about the first encounter in a long time and was not expecting to see anything unusual on this trail, since I had walked it so many times without incident. As I walked along, I noticed that a stick lying by the trail was moving. The next thing I knew, this stick started to float and sort of melt, almost as if it was made out of wax and had been exposed to a flame. The waxy looking stick melted and morphed and then took the shape of some kind of winged creature. It all happened so fast I couldn't even believe it. The stick floated up in the air, melted like liquid wax, turned into a winged creature, and then went invisible. That's what happened. I don't know what it was. I don't know what either of these things were. The only thing I can come up with is fairy. Thank you for allowing me to share my story. I was brought up in Wollaston, and back then a lot of the area was woods, fields, old dried up canals, ponds, slag heaps of coal, etc., where we used to play as children. We were probably about half a mile from Wollaston Park main gates, and back then you could almost walk to Wollaston Park without going out of the woods and the fields. I'm 50 now, so I'm going back to the late 1970s. One evening in summer, me and a friend were stood on the side of an old dried out canal. It was midsummer, maybe 9 o'clock at night. Just going dark, but you could still see quite well. I glanced across the other side of the canal, and directly opposite us was a small, shiny white humanoid creature, about 18 inches high. You couldn't see its face because it was too bright and shiny. It was glowing white like a light bulb, but shaped like a small person. I just felt like it was looking at us and standing still. My friend was really scared. He had really short hair, but I can remember what bit of hair he had was sticking up on his head. I wasn't so scared and climbed into the dried up canal with the intention of climbing up the other side to get a better look at the glowing creature. My friend followed. As we moved closer, the creature bolted into a small wooded area and then out onto the big field. We chased it, but it was moving too fast, so we slowed down and stood there and watched it get further across the field until it disappeared out of sight. This experience never bothered me, but it really affected my friend. He was scared of dolls and ventriloquist dummies after that, Action Man toys, anything like that thing we saw. He discussed it with me for years after and told me he could never watch a Chucky movie because dolls terrified him now. Not too long after, maybe even only a few months, we heard about these kids who saw gnomes in Wollaston Park. We even went there looking for them, but found nothing. That's it. That's what happened to me. I always wondered if what we saw was connected in any way with the kids at Wollaston Park, because it was very much in the same area. This fairy experience took place in a little town in Mendoza, Argentina. The people who were involved in this experience were my grandmother, Rosa. She was 12, and her two brothers, who were 8 and 6. It happened around noon. At that time, my grandmother had the responsibility of delivering a snack to her stepfather, who was working on a farm approximately 5 miles away, and she brought her younger brothers along. It was customary for them to bring breakfast or snacks to their older relatives working in the fields, depending on the occasion. They ventured into the farmland where they often played and had adventures. My grandmother often reminisced about playing out there in those fields and how beautiful they were. While the kids were out there playing around, the air seemed to shift. Suddenly, grandmother heard a scream and saw one of her brothers pointing and shouting, "Elf! Elf!" She looked over and saw this thing emerge out of the meadow that was on the other side of the gate. It was pig-headed, but humanoid, and moving so fast it seemed to be floating. It vanished just as quickly as it had appeared, and then a second strange creature appeared in the same meadow. This one seemed to be a short man with very dark brownish skin, holding a stick in his hand. He waved at the children and signaled to them like he was calling them to come over and play with him. But they did not, which was probably a good thing. Instead, they were so frightened they took off, and the three of them raced all the way back home. But all three remember the encounter and describe what happened pretty much the same way. There are cultural myths in the area about this type of creature known as an elf or duende. Experiences like these are part of regional folklore and belief and are passed down through generations, creating myths and local legends. The people of this region are known for being serious, hard workers, and Catholic. They would never make up a story like this. This story came secondhand to me through a family member. My brother-in-law decided to tell me a tale about his elder brother, who as a child experienced a strange encounter. You need to bear in mind that this person who had this strange experience does not tend to believe in anything supernatural or otherworldly. He's a grown man now in his 60s and has always been and continues to be upright, sensible, and logical. This story occurred when he was aged around 12 years old. Could have been slightly younger. He was walking in the woods in the Midland County of the UK, doing what little boys at that age generally do when they're alone and bored. He was kicking the leaves on the woodland path and swiping the air with his stick at some imaginary foe. He remembers feeling what he can only describe as strange. The environment seemed to change, as if he was being watched. He looked around for a while, and seeing nothing or no one, he carried on walking until he came upon this gnarled old tree. He could see that it looked quite fragile and thought the branches looked ideal for building a small camp to hide in, so he proceeded to wrench at the branches. He pulled one branch off and then another, and then suddenly he heard rustling in the leaves. He couldn't see anything, only movement of something in the leaves. Before he could make another move, he felt himself whisked into the air. His short trousers had been pulled off, and he was suddenly hanging upside down from a tree in his underpants. His ankle was tied to a tree branch with his own shorts. He was now looking at the woodland floor upside down and could make out little people scurrying around and laughing. He felt an overwhelming sense of panic and was sure that he was being hit with sticks and branches. He began shouting and crying out for help. After what seemed to be a few minutes, his own weight caused him to fall. He landed on the floor and, having only sustained a few cuts and bruises, jumped up and without a second thought, he ran. He ran non-stop without looking back or around him. He just looked forward and continued to do so until he reached home. He blurted out to his parents what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe him. He was obviously making it up, wasn't he? Many years later, his younger brother asked him about the story, as it had initially caused him to be the butt of many jokes. But as the years passed, it had been forgotten. At this point, he was the manager of a large company and believed in science and not the paranormal. However, he maintained that the incident happened, but he never spoke of it afterwards and has never spoken of it since. If it's ever mentioned, he turns pale and changes the subject. My own opinion is that the Fae were angry with his disrespect of the gnarled old tree that day and decided to teach him a lesson. This happened in Canada, in BC, during the 1960s. It was a repeating experience, one which occurred to me as a young child recovering from polio. I was rather a lonely kid, both shy and fierce. I spent a lot of time alone. I sang a lot. I would make up songs and music and sing as I played in our back garden or down in the deep wooded ravine nearby. The woods I played in were an old, old wood in an area that had been logged during the early part of the 20th century and then reforested, except for one old forest of giant cedar trees, which somehow had been missed. It stood proud above the forest and was visible for miles, sticking up out of the surrounding woods and fields. Anyway, sometimes on my adventures in the ravine and in the woods, singing to myself, I would see fairies, or what I thought were fairies. They were not so much wee folk as in the Victorian illustrations, but movement and mist that seemed to form figures. They appeared in two places, down by this old cedar tree which grew beside a pond in spring, and on an old brick walk that my father laid down outside our back door. The bricks on this walkway came from a Victorian-era building which had been burnt in a fire, and so had gone to a scrapyard where we had bought them. The fairies were adult-sized. if not taller actually, and they were quiet and graceful. They would dance and seemed cheerful most of the time. They seemed to be made of moving mist, which coalesced in human like forms. I saw them often. I was convinced they were real and that they were fairies. I also remember whenever I saw them, everything would get louder and more vivid, as if the leaves rustling in the breeze suddenly bumped up the volume. It was almost like I was seeing into another world. Eventually, as I grew older, I stopped seeing them. I should also mention the area has a reputation as being haunted. I'm a reception class teacher who regularly takes my class to a local park where we have a forest school type session in a woodland area. With a group of children, we were examining the exposed roots of a small tree that had been blown down in a storm the previous day. Someone began to hit the root network with a stick, and a boy cried, "Look, fairies! Fairies are coming out!" I looked, but I didn't see anything at all. I asked the boy what these fairies looked like, and he pointed into the air around us and said, just little, like tiny lights. I looked around and I could see nothing. Then another boy came over to the tree, looked around, laughed, and said, "Oh, fairies." Both boys were clearly looking at the same thing, which I couldn't see. I was, however, convinced that something had emerged from the disturbed tree roots because two different children had witnessed it independently, and they were absolutely certain that they could see fairies. I tend to believe them because I know these boys, and they aren't the kind of kids to make up things like that. I know that all children are exposed to the concept of fairies in stories, films, etc. But these were boys who weren't particularly interested in those types of stories or games. And if they were making it up, they were very good actors. And I know these boys aren't very good actors. They were looking at something that I couldn't see. And they thought whatever it was fairies. Thanks for watching. As many of you know, I just released my first fairy novel, The Ghosts of Nothing. I spent a lot of time researching fairy folklore for this novel and coming up with my own explanations for certain fairy folklore conventions. For example, why names are so important to fairies, the mysterious connection between fairies and ghosts, and much more. And I weave those theories of mine into what is otherwise an exciting adventure story about a girl from a town called Nothing. For those who don't know, in the story, the town is famously haunted, but as you will soon discover if you read the book, and I hope you will, fairies have more to do with this town's troubles than ghosts. I really think fans of this channel will have a lot of fun reading The Ghosts of Nothing and finding all of those fairy folklore references, as well as delving into my version of the fairy world, which is definitely based on folklore and just my own intuition about what that world might be like. One of the things I really love about doing this channel and just immersing myself in fairy folklore is exploring that potential alternate world and imagining what it might be like based on all the clues left to us in folklore. So if you want to delve into what I think the fairy world is like, this book is definitely the way to do it. I want to thank everyone who did pick up their copy and all the fantastic, amazing reviews I've been getting on Amazon and Goodreads. Thank you so much for those. I'm so happy that you took a chance on the book and that you had a great time reading it. This is my first novel, and that people would have fun reading the book, that they would connect with the characters and care for them, and just experience an incredible, otherworldly, magical adventure was one of my prime goals. And judging by the reactions so far, I think I've accomplished that. So I'm just really thrilled. And I'm getting to work on the next book. So, which a lot of you have been asking me about. It's coming. It's a work in progress, but it's definitely on the way. As usual, I'd like to thank everyone for watching and to the subscribers who submitted their stories for this one. If you have a story to share, you can check out my website at scaryfairygodmother.com, link in the description. It has a spot where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, or suggestions. You can also sign up for my mailing list there, Fairy Lights. Extra special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon and to anyone who joined the channel or made a one-time donation through PayPal or Ko-fi. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page and the other support options in the description below. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census. To read the original Census stories, please follow the link in the description below. You can also contribute to the Fairy Census from that same link. The stories were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. Please like, comment below, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel. And hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. Also, sign up for Fairy Lights for guaranteed notifications of new videos if YouTube isn't being reliable for you. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.